Hi, I'm Max Keiser, and this is the Keiser Report. Yeah, you know, them folks on Wall Street and around the world in the banking industry love a good disaster because it means that they can issue trillions more bonds and pocket themselves billions more fees. Let's get some more details from Stacy Herbert.
Max, the first headline we see, the true heart of disaster capitalist. Larry Kudlow devalues human life with a Japan earthquake, Freudian slip.
The human toll here looks to be much worse than the economic toll, and we can be grateful for that. And the human toll is a tragedy, we know that. But these markets are, all these markets, right? Stocks, commodities, oil, gold, there is no major breakout or breakdown.
As the traders told us, oil is very much a part of this today because oil is moving lower. They feel as though this is good news for the U.S.
Yeah, Larry Kudlow and CNBC are genocidal maniacs. They would love to put people in ovens and burn them for a profit if they had a chance. They would take Auschwitz public, Larry Kudlow, if he had a chance, because he's a despicable, vile, something gross that you find on the bottom of your shoe.
Larry Kudlow did apologize via a tweet saying, I misspoke. Let's look at these, the true heart of our global financial and economic system and all the remaining headlines here. Saudi troops arrive in Bahrain to suppress protests. The Saudi intervention came 2 days after U.S. Defense Secretary Robert Gates visited Manama and held talks with the king in which he said he urged them to undertake rapid and significant reform. Now, Robert Gates also visited Cairo when we were there, and soon after, all the thugs appeared again.
What I don't get is America spends, what, $1.5 trillion, $2 trillion a year on military. They take more than half the tax and spend it on military toys. They occupy countries all over the world. They send unmanned drones into Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iraq, kill civilians left and right. They've got a clear target in Tripoli. One unmanned drone, take them out. But they say, no, we have to equivocate on this. We need to deliberate on this. So is it just, as Tony Blair would suggest, you only lift a finger to do anything in this world if you get a big payout from the oil industry and that's it? Shameless.
Well, there is a huge interconnected financial link between Libya and Europe. So perhaps that's why he's not doing that. But in Bahrain, the Saudi troops came in the day after the largest protest in Bahrain, in which they shut down the financial district. So that is always very important to whether or not intervention arrives.
People are waking up to the fact that the true terrorists are the bankers. And unless you take the bankers out of the picture, you're going to be living in a ghetto.
Now, you have often mentioned the digital economy and the role of the internet in these revolutions happening throughout the Arab world. These are the controversial satellite photos that set off protests in Bahrain. So these are from Google Earth. And Bahrain's oppressed and overcrowded Shiite majority began using Google Earth to view palaces and other estates that make up 95% of the country. As these images churned up discontent, the government blocked Google Earth. But as you can see from these images here, this is a PDF that was created from the images that they captured before the Bahraini government basically banned Google Earth from Bahrain. But you can see that the Shiite majority is forced into the little 5% of this already tiny oil-rich kingdom.
Yeah. Well, the transparency that comes with the proliferation of the internet and social media has given people the fortitude and the vision to effect regime changes and to insurrect, rightfully so.
And if you look at these images again, you'll see that they highlight the golf courses, yachts, horse tracks. These are all at royal palaces, the many royal palaces throughout the country in the 95% of the land that the royal family occupies. They also highlight, these big palaces. They often ask, how did he get it? Because according to the Constitution of Bahrain, the resources of the nation are the ownership of the state. The state owns the resources. The people own the resources. But it looks like from Google Earth that it exposes the lie that, in fact, a small family occupies and owns 95% of the wealth of the nation. So we have these royalty and these oligarchs around the world controlling 95% of the wealth of most nations or thereabouts, close to it. And the peasants fight amongst each other for the little Scrabble heaps of it. And in fact, in Bahrain, you have the Shiites are split in half. One half is negotiating with their monarchy, and the other half isn't. Now, this brings us to America, Wisconsin firefighter spark move your money moment. So on the day that the bill passed the Wisconsin Assembly, effectively ending 50 years of collective bargaining in Wisconsin, hundreds of firefighters walked across the street from the Wisconsin Capitol and stood outside the Marshall and Isley Bank, M&I Bank. And one by one, they closed their accounts and withdrew their life savings, totaling approximately $190,000. So these hundreds of firemen and their $190,000. Now, the bank itself, why they were targeting M&I Bank, is this bank is one of the biggest backers of Scott Walker, the governor. And the bank received $2 billion in TARP funds. They have not paid this back. The bank is about to be sold off to Canada, into which, of course, in this transaction, something will happen that they'll never have to pay back the U.S.
Money laundering.
So this is why they protested this bank.
Of course. Well, it's the sound of one hand clapping. In other words, if you're going to move your money, if you're going to take your money out, you got to do something with it. You just can't put it into another corrupt bank. You've got to buy silver bullion with it. This is the only way to crash the banking system because they're over-leveraged and they're silver shorts. They've sold silver they don't own. If you take physical silver off the market, you crash the banks, principally the biggest financial terrorist in the world, of course, J.P. Morgan. But M&I is hooked into this. Obviously, they've done a deal with TARP. They took billions. They gave back nothing. They're leeching from the community. And the people who are trying to work a decent living in that area are rightfully insurrecting. Go for it!
From this article, it's a very bizarre little fact put in here. And remember, the peasants are tearing each other apart. Half of the peasants in Wisconsin are against the peasant workers in the public sector unions, the firefighters, the policemen, and the nurses and the teachers. They're against them. A tunnel in the M&I parking garage links to the Capitol basement. Dubbed the rat hole to the Walker Palace, the tunnel was used by Governor Scott Walker to ferry lobbyists into the Capitol building to hear his budget address. Well, the Capitol building was shut down. So this bank has a secret tunnel that goes directly into the Capitol building. A private corporation has a direct link into the Capitol building where they don't have to go mix with the riffraff. And who knows, and lobbyists are being funneled in and out. And yet the people are out there fighting each other. The peasants are fighting each other. And they're not fighting to stop this corrupt system.
Wait. Let me get this straight. The peasants are in the street fighting each other. Meanwhile, there's a tunnel. There's an underground tunnel from the bank to the Capitol building.
That's correct. This is what this article says.
So they're just doing their money laundering and their gun running and their all this criminal activity through an underground tunnel between the bank and the Capitol building, and the peasants are outside squabbling with each other. Oh, you're a union. You're not a union. You're a public union. You're not a public union. What are these peasants waiting for?
And then, the half of the peasants are fighting on the side of the monarchs and the oligarchs. Well, in the bill that was just passed, the governor may sell any state-owned heating, cooling, and power plant or may contract with a private entity for the operation of any such plant with or without solicitation of bids for any amount that the department determines to be in the best interest of the state. So going back to Bahrain, where 95% of the assets are held by one small family, now this guy could sell to Koch Industries, for example, energy industry company, that they could sell it to them for any price they deem is a good buy, a good sell, a good deal for the state.
It's all for sale. So whether it's Wisconsin, Bahrain, or Dublin, Ireland, of course, they just got a new deal with their new government where they're going to just start selling pieces off of that country to the creditors for no reason other than to make a few guys rich. So it's the corporate occupation. And people are revolting against the corporate occupation. But so far they have no scalps. They have no wins. There hasn't been a regime change except in Tunisia and Egypt. Those are the only two successful regime changes we've seen in the global insurrection against banker occupation. We haven't seen anything in Europe yet. Portugal looks good. Ireland looks good. Greece looks good. I think one of those countries should get a regime change soon. In the U.S., you've got these states. Scott Walker is the Mubarak of the Midwest. I mean, he should be replaced immediately. Just go down to the Capitol building, stand out there with a pitchfork and whatever, and just wait until the guy comes out.
But Max, he's just one of these peasants. He's a peasant. That's how they operate. They divide and conquer the peasants. They give him 100,000 a year. Who knows how much he makes? And they make him feel important. David Koch calls him, even if it's a fake David Koch, and he feels like an important guy. And he'll squash and destroy those other peasants out there, those firefighters out there.
I'm saying we need to get some wins, though. Okay, overthrow that Wisconsin guy, Scott Walker, and then move to the Koch brothers, then move to the New York Fed, then move to the Fed in Washington. Get some wins on the scoreboard. Get some points on the scoreboard, because right now it's peasants 0, monarchs are 100 points. They got all the points. Peasants have got nothing.
Speaking of winning,
Duh.
Charlie Sheen, secret silver investor? A person writing under the name Charlie Sheen, the disgraced sitcom actor, they call him, filed a comment with the Commodity Futures Trading Commission last week, and he recommended the agency adopt more conservative position limits on derivatives tied to silver. It's not as though silver bugs, already a crew prone to conspiracy theories about speculators and market manipulation, needed more reasons to worry. But in Charlie Sheen's March 1st memo, the writer asked the CFTC to readjust its proposed position limits in silver. Sheen says that the current formula would result in a position limit of over 5,000 contracts for any single speculator. The memo writer said that the limit is equivalent to 25 million ounces of silver. Only 3 mining companies worldwide produce that much silver each year.
Charlie Sheen is right. Charlie Sheen is part of the Silver Liberation Army. Charlie Sheen is supporting the New World Disorder. Charlie Sheen is welcome on this show. I would be more than happy to have you as my guest to discuss these and other topics. I reached out to his people through my people, and I haven't heard back yet. But Charlie, give us a call. Okay, well, Stacy Herbert, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max.
When I come back, I'll be talking with Michael Betancourt all about a really interesting variation on the theme of capitalism. So don't go away. Hi, welcome back to the Keiser Report. Time now to talk with artist, media historian, and critical theorist Michael Betancourt, who writes about the digital economy. Michael, welcome to the Keiser Report.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
All right, Michael, you have coined the phrase agnotologic capitalism. What is it?
It's the idea that we're now living in a capitalist state that is at least partially supported by misinformation, systematic disinformation, and a kind of general confusion of what is fact and what is not. What's physically real, what is immaterial.
Okay, so when people talk about the efficient market theory, for example, that prices reflect all known information, using your thought process, we should be talking about the inefficient market theory, that prices have to incorporate this agnotological model, which is, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's the study of misinformation. It's how misinformation is pushed into the system as a quantity unto itself, correct?
It's actually a little bit more than that. It's not just the pushing of the misinformation into the system. It's the specific construction of misinformation in order to deceive the system, in order to drive, say, markets, in order to make decisions that would not otherwise be made, to confuse the ability to make these decisions.
Okay, now how does this differ from, let's say, propaganda?
Propaganda is prima facie not true when we're talking of black propaganda. That's propaganda created to deceive. Agnotology doesn't set out to create disinformation. It sets out to create doubt about what is known. And it does this by following the standard procedures and simply arriving at different results, usually because it begins with a different set of assumptions or takes other values into account.
This sounds an awful lot like what we saw during the 1950s and 60s when the cigarette companies were trying to push this idea that actually cigarette smoking was healthy. I mean, isn't that an example of this?
That's actually where the term was originally created by Professor Proctor. He was studying how cigarette companies raised confusion about the nature and the risk of their products. And so that's where this entire framework originates and has since expanded in much the same way that everything tends to expand over time. So now we see not just cigarettes, but the risks associated with almost any product we could choose, or any commercial or financial investment that we might encounter. There was a certain degree of this involved in its presentation.
All right, let's move on to the digital economy and digital capitalism, something you write about a lot. What attracts you to this topic? Fill us in on some of the highlights here.
What attracted me to it is the fact that so much of our economy seems to be digital now. Digital has infected, let's say, if we want to think of it as a contagion, infected most of our culture. And the initial approach to this that I was interested in was the question of digital rights management, and how digital rights management seemed to be a necessary evolution, whether we want it or not, whether we like it or not, a necessary evolution of how digital technology has functioned. Because we've had it since the 1980s, when the first commercially available digital commodities became available. And so I was asking that question, and it evolved as I was in the course of doing the thinking and the research into something that I call the aura of the digital. Now, this concept is kind of pernicious because we find it absolutely everywhere. The idea of the aura of the digital is simply that when we deal with something that is digital, or we deal with something that could be digital, the first thing that happens is we forget to think about the physical costs and the physical supports and all of the material things that go along with having a digital connection. We don't think about the internet backbone, the hardware that supports the internet. We don't really think about the costs of maintaining that. What we only think about is, oh, look, I can click on this thing here, I can download whatever this digital thing is. It arrives, it's beautiful because it's just as good as all of the other digital copies. And so it doesn't seem to cost anything. But there are very real costs in there, and the aura of the digital serves to mask those. What happens is this aura of the digital is not just concerned with cultural products. It's actually something that expands throughout our culture and has literally expanded since the 1980s. So we get something like the housing bubble that just burst in the last few years, and the new possible bubbles in, say, municipal bonds or government bonds or treasuries, depending on who you want to listen to. And all of these potential bubbles, and the ones that have already burst, like the housing bubble or the dot-com bubble or the savings and loan bubble, these bubbles are reflections of how there is a rupture between the immaterial concerns of the aura of the digital, which it describes, and the kind of paradoxes that it describes.
Let me walk through an example of this, since I've got this in my brain here. If somebody is, let's say, creating a digital farm on Farmville, which is a game by Facebook, and they have a digital barn and they use a digital currency, they're immersed in the digital space, and they tend to take that digital aura thinking and apply it to their actual house, and they fail to see that their actual house has real costs involved in that house. And I think you also make a connection to labor and how labor is fitted into this equation.
Well, the problem here is that when we shift to a digital capitalism, following on this kind of pervasive expansion of the aura of the digital, where we shift from a material physical capitalism, one that's based in actual production and wages and labor and all of that, to an immaterial one. The danger, and this is what I think has happened, is that we've had a transfer from this digital realm into the less than digital realms, such as the financial markets in the form of financialization. Because financialization at a kind of basic level is a reshuffling of immaterial commodities. You take, say, the gold index, and you generate a commodity based on selling futures based on the gold index rather than the physical gold. So you end up making money based on something else that may not actually be connected to something physical. Actually, there's another kind of exponential shift here, where you take it a step further and you start chopping up what are theoretically tied to physical commodities, credit default obligations, for instance, like mortgages. And you securitize these. And then you securitize your securitized investments. And you chop all of this up into very, very tiny tracts. And then you sell these tranches as bundled things. And you make money not based on the objects that they're connected to, but on the chopping up, resampling, reassembly, and selling, which is fundamentally a semiotic procedure, a matter of language. You're manipulating signs. That is the immaterial dimension of immaterial capitalism. And when that happens, you've essentially removed labor from your market. If you automate your market with high-frequency traders that follow algorithms, and you eliminate all of the human elements to this, or you minimize them as much as possible, which is what has happened, then you have this fully autonomous, automated, immaterial version of capitalism that generates values through circulation rather than through the actual sale of something that is tangible. This is, of course, why we get collapses.
Right, and you need some accreditation from institutional players in all this. For example, the Federal Reserve Bank, other investment banks, rating agencies, and all these players, and the government has to give these things a seal of approval and give them an A rating or an A+ rating, even though what they're exchanging back and forth is a phantasmagorical representations of a digital tranche as a derivative of something that was a concatenation in somebody's imagination over lunch before they went out for a couple of martinis, and they call that a deal. They give themselves a huge fee, but at the end of the day, they're just programming the computers to steal. Isn't that correct?
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily say steal.
Why not? Why not? Because, for example, high-frequency trading is a siphon. They're siphoning capital off the floor of the exchange for no work. As you point out, it's fully automated. They put in no labor, they steal the money. How is that not stealing?
The reason it's not stealing is that everyone involved is profiting from this process.
How do the people in America who are having their currency debased because of the stealing that's going on by Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan by using high-frequency trading on the floor of the exchange, how come they are not participating in this? They're getting penalized by this. They're victims of this.
Yes. I just don't think that the stealing is necessarily the right verb for this. It's something else. Stealing involves that there is some kind of physical commodity that's being stolen. That the currency is being debased implies that if we didn't do this, the currency would be solvent. And the whole problem here is that the currency itself is disconnected from any kind of physical value. It exists as a debt against future production rather than a store of value. And all of this comes back to the immaterial basis that we're now living in. So yes, in a sense, you could say that they're stealing. In a greater sense, they're not really stealing because there's nothing to be stolen.
Right. So the people who are victimized by this, they should take solace in the fact that when it all started, they weren't worth anything to begin with.
Basically, yes. I know that sounds terribly perverse. The reality is that this is an unsustainable system, and that the inevitability of its collapse has been there almost from the beginning, because the entire system is based on a currency that is not based on anything. It exists only in relation to other currencies. It itself is semiotic.
Let me just cut in here. The perversion of this is obvious to those who can see how these machinations work. What's perverse about it is that people who are out there in the streets in Wisconsin fighting for a few crumbs from the table don't understand that what they're fighting is an illusory model that doesn't even exist. That they're scrambling for virtual crumbs, essentially. They don't even understand how perverse the system is. They don't even have any comprehension of how far away they are from the nexus of the capital producing mechanism and the larceny, the digital larceny that's going on. That's perverse.
Yes, it is. And what makes it even more perverse is that what they're fighting for is the continuation of basically their entrapment. That's the truly perverse part of this, is that the powers that are currently acting and that are causing these riots, protests, rebellions, whatever you want to call them, they're basically fighting for their own survival. And the shift that's happening is perverse because we're driving towards a collapse, and it's almost inevitable that we're going to have this collapse again at some point. And to a certain extent, I think it may have already started with the credit freeze in 2009. And the attempt to basically print our way out of the problem isn't going to result in hyperinflation necessarily, although there are people who are saying that it will, so much as it's going to result in a complete revaluation of the system in which we arrive at some other new equilibrium. And part of the problem to getting there is that there are forces that are more or less fighting over who has the largest number of these essentially immaterial objects, this immaterial currency. And what will happen is at some point they will have most of it, and we're moving towards that already if you look at any of the various numbers in terms of who has the wealth and who doesn't. What will happen when it gets concentrated enough is the entire system itself will simply freeze up like it did in 2009. And that's because the equilibrium and the maintenance and the survival of this system depends upon the circulation of these immaterial commodities. As soon as they start getting hoarded, or as soon as people who have them start cashing out and into some kind of physical commodity, both of these can trigger an imminent collapse. Not in the sense of necessarily a bank run or a panic, but in the sense that the system can no longer feasibly be able to maintain its own equilibrium. And as it drives towards ever greater disequilibrium, because that's the ground state for this kind of a situation, where you have vast immaterial production versus limited physical production.
Michael Betancourt, thanks for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you. I was glad to be here.
Alrighty, and that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. I want to thank my guest, Michael Betancourt. If you want to send me an email, please do so at keiserreport@rttv.ru. Until next time, this is Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.